And joining us now on the debate in Washington, D.C., Hussein Ibish, Senior Research Fellow at the American Task Force on Palestine, and he writes the blog ibishblog.com. Randall Hansen, Professor of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Mohammed Tavakoli of the Department of Historical Studies, History and Middle Eastern Civilizations at the University of Toronto. And Obiora Okafor, Professor of Law at Osgoode Hall Law School. Happy to have you three here in studio. And Hussein, it's good to have you on the program for the first time as well from Washington, D.C. And Obi, this is your first time here too, and we're glad to have you. Okay, in case anybody, I know nobody on this program missed it, but in case any of our viewers missed it, here is President Obama Monday night in what has been a much discussed speech. Michael, roll tape, please.
There will be times, though, when our safety is not directly threatened, but our interests and our values are. Sometimes the course of history poses challenges that threaten our common humanity and our common security. Responding to natural disasters, for example, or preventing genocide and keeping the peace, ensuring regional security and maintaining the flow of commerce. These may not be America's problems alone, but they are important to us. They're problems worth solving. And in these circumstances, we know that the United States, as the world's most powerful nation, will often be called upon to help.
President Obama from Monday night. Hussein, I want to go to you first. The crucial phrase here, of course, our interests and our values. Do you think the President has succeeded in making the case for American values demanding military engagement in Libya?
Yeah, I think he did, because I think what he explained is here we have a confluence between interests and values. In other cases, there are affronts to values, like the situation in Cote d'Ivoire or in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but not interests. In other cases, there are, like Bahrain, for example, there are interests that trump values. But in the case of Libya, I think what he's saying is there's values that have to do with the severe humanitarian threat as Gaddafi's forces began to advance towards Benghazi, and he was threatening in no uncertain terms a massacre, and there was a real possibility, as people in the White House were describing it, of another Srebrenica, and that was not a fictitious thing. All you had to do was listen to Gaddafi, combined with American interests. Now, he kind of hinted at what those interests were, but I think it's very clear that as momentum shifted in the Libyan civil war towards the Gaddafi regime, and as it looked like Benghazi, the rebel stronghold, might fall to Gaddafi, the international community, the West, the United States, and the Arab world were faced with the prospect of a bloodied, enraged, embittered, empowered, and oil-rich Muammar Gaddafi stalking the region and the globe with a new revenge agenda that went far beyond Libya and probably far beyond the Middle East. And the question is, was that an acceptable outcome? And the answer is no. So you have that confluence of interests and values, and that he set out not a doctrine, but a set of criteria by which the United States would act in concert with others.
Having said that,
and I think it was very, very persuasive.
Having said that, let me read a little chunk here from British-Pakistani intellectual Tariq Ali, who had this to say. The U.S.-NATO intervention in Libya with United Nations Security Council cover is part of an orchestrated response to show support for the movement against one dictator in particular, and by so doing, to bring the Arab rebellions to an end by asserting Western control, confiscating their impetus and spontaneity, and trying to restore the status quo ante. It is absurd to think that the reasons for bombing Tripoli or for the turkey shoot outside Benghazi are designed to protect civilians. The sheer cynicism is breathtaking. We're expected to believe that the leaders with bloody hands in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan are defending the people in Libya. Randall, let me go to you for a reaction to that. Do you think Western hands are too dirty to be able to act out of humanitarian impetus?
No, no, I don't think they are. I mean, I think that commentary says more about Tariq Ali's paranoia than it does on the facts on the ground. I think the point that Hussein just put was a very apt and convincing one. Here we had, which we rarely have, a nice convergence or confluence of interests and values. As far as the other accusations, Afghanistan, Iraq, Pakistan, we need a slightly more subtle and differentiated conversation about those. But we may come back to that or not.
We may come back to that.
Yeah.
Obi, what do you say on that issue of whether the West's hands are too dirty right now in order to really be believed for its role in Libya?
I don't think so. I think that certainly in history you can find instances where that was the case. But I don't think that, as Randall has just said, I think you need to have a subtle differentiation between particular instances. You can't lump every instance of intervention together. I always give the example, ECOMOG, the Economic Community of West African States, their military group, went into Liberia twice. The first time was a cynical attempt. Liberians resisted them. They started shooting at them even before they landed, the boats landed. The second time, Liberians welcomed them. People can tell these subtle differences. So, I think the situation in Libya is as close as it gets to a humanitarian catastrophe, a catastrophe that may justify intervention. That doesn't mean that others necessarily meet the criteria.
Understood. Mohammed, let me try this with you. President Assad of Syria today told the Syrian parliament, quote, "I do not want people to say that I'm blaming what has happened internally on external plots, but they are interlinked." How widespread do you think this suspiciousness of Western fingers in every pie goes?
Well, going back to Libya, you'll see that in the beginning of the civil movement, democratic movement, Gaddafi was blaming it on rats and people who were drunkard, and then blamed it later on drugs, and later on Al-Qaeda, and now he has become the champion of defending the national interest of Libya, and he has become, once again, is recasting himself as nationalist champion and champion of sovereignty of Libya. I think this is part of the ongoing rhetoric, nationalist rhetoric, that has been dominant in the Middle East, at least since World War II. And anytime that you have an important democratic development, always the national interest and the interest of the citizens go counter to one another. And anytime that you have external support for internal democratic forces, authoritarian states and leaders like Gaddafi immediately blame it on external forces.
So that's par for the course.
Yes.
We started our program with some tape. I want to play some more tape right now, and this is from an Al Jazeera program called Inside Story. This is from a program back in January, and it's about the lack of American response to events that were taking place at the time in Tunisia. Let's watch this piece of tape and then we'll come back and chat. Michael, roll tape, please.
Hesitant, unwilling and tight-lipped, the Western reaction to the Tunisian uprising made people across the Arab world wonder whether democracy in Tunisia will be allowed to run its full course. Will Western powers try to influence the outcome of the Tunisian revolt if it does not serve their interest, or if it indeed threatens them?
Now, there is, Hussein, I guess you could argue, a sense in that introduction from that presenter there that, you know, one gets a sense that the United States and other Western countries are kind of in a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario. If you get involved, we're going to criticize you for that. If you don't get involved and help this nascent democracy get its feet going, we're going to blame you for that. Would you agree?
Yeah. No, well, I think it's a conundrum, and it is, of course, the legacy of colonial and imperial past, and so we're just going to have to live with that. However, the important thing is that in the end, the Obama administration got it right in with fits and starts, both in Libya and eventually even in Egypt. And I think they more or less ended up siding with the protesters against the regime, and that was important. Now, in Bahrain, they certainly didn't do that because of the Fifth Fleet and real concerns about Iranian designs in Bahrain. And in some other cases, they don't know what to do, like in Yemen and in Syria. Again, these are very complicated. In the case of Libya, what was really remarkable was that it was a great opportunity, especially after that first psychotic speech that Gaddafi gave, where he said this was an American Al-Qaeda joint plot based on putting hallucinogenic tablets in people's Nescafe and threatened to go house to house and cleanse the country. And it was a completely crazy speech.
You sound unpersuaded by that.
That was a moment, I think. Yeah, that was a moment when I think, you know, Western intervention, American intervention would have been received maximally as a humanitarian rescue operation, to save a vulnerable people from a mad dictator. And it would have really helped place the United States on the side of Arab reform, even when it can't always be, like for instance, in Bahrain, it can't really be very enthusiastic about that. But it's extremely important for the United States and the West generally to make sure that the Arab peoples don't think that we are so addicted to regional stability and oil supplies and other basic interests that we regard any dramatic or revolutionary change in the Arab world as inherently undesirable.
I see.
And I
now,
think,
let me try this with Obi here, though, if I can.
I think the president has helped to dispel that.
Okay, Hussein, thank you. We hear this all the time. You guys came too late. No, wait, you guys came too early. You put in too much. No, wait, you didn't put in enough. Please come. No, please go away. How are we supposed to make sense of this relationship between the West and its former colonies?
I think, as Hussein just said, it's a complex relationship. It's a conundrum, as much of history is, right? So you have these competing forces always operating. You know, I don't want to go back to Hegel and people like that to say. So you always have these forces operating. So I think that we have to have an ethnographic understanding of each situation as not the same, and and it's important not to have a one-size-fits-all kind of approach, even though you can have broad approaches, but that in the end, different situations and different. I don't mean this as a kind of apology for contradictions and being cynical about certain situations, but I think that certain broad principles matter. For example, I agree with Hussein that the Obama administration this time more or less got it right. I think they may have waited a week too late, but the instinct of waiting, building a coalition. When you look at the Security Council vote, the fact that China, India, Russia abstained tells you that there was a lot of preparatory work that was going on, building a coalition, getting UN Security Council authorization.
More legitimacy.
More legitimacy, and not just in the Arab world, more legitimacy everywhere. I tell you, Nigerians, for example, find themselves often in the situation that the US finds itself. Nobody likes Nigerian troops, who tend to be the bulk of any fighting force in West Africa going in. They tend to look at Nigerians in the same way, almost like in America. And so we are sensitive, you know, as someone who grew up in Nigeria, to those kinds of sensibilities. So it's not necessarily an anti-Western thing. It's just about how do you sort of exercise power in a kind of sort of sensible and effective way in the world that we live in.
Mohammed, let me pick your brain on this. Now, remind me, you're from Iran originally? Is that right?
I'm originally from Iran, and this is a really important issue to address. I greatly admire President Obama. I think he made a mistake. You cannot enhance democratic values and strengthen civil societies through military action. We have already example of Afghanistan. Taliban had totally lost legitimacy, and the invasion has brought them back into the picture. Saddam Hussein on his last day had lost legitimacy. The invasion sort of helped to recover his image as a much more important person, and I think his allies are playing a much more important role in Iraq today than they did during his
So
last
America
days.
should not have gone into Libya?
I think they should not have gone in. It has transformed a civil resistance into a military struggle. It has moved something that could have potentially empowered the civil society and the individuals, and now it has become a military maneuver.
Randall.
Well, I mean,
Can I?
Let me get Randall.
Let
me get Randall first, Hussein, and then I'll come back to you.
I would say the military was there not. The intervention was not to build a society. It was to prevent a massacre. So the original aim of the military was not to build a civil society.
That's if you believe what the stated goal of this is, and a lot of people don't.
As I do, but yeah, of course, I agree. More broadly, I think we also have to look at this in different contexts. In the case of Germany and Japan, a combination of a military and civilian occupation after a decisive set of military defeats did an outstanding job, especially in Germany, of building a civil society. So I wouldn't want to take Mohammed's statement as sort of a universal truth.
Okay, Hussein, come on in.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Mohammed made a very I agree largely with what he said about Afghanistan. Not that something didn't have to be done, but that the way it was done certainly backfired vis-a-vis the Taliban. With Iraq, it was clearly a disaster. I mean, this was a war that never should have happened and was ill-conceived and ill-considered from the start. This is different because here we do not have, and we are not going to have, boots on the ground. This is not going to impose a Western solution on Libya. It is merely going to prevent Gaddafi from crushing an indigenous revolt that began without the West creating it, you see. And so in a sense, it is an intervention in a civil war, but it is not going to determine the outcome of that war. It is going to prevent one outcome that is unacceptable, which is a total Gaddafi victory. Whether it produces regime change in the long run, I don't know. I hope it does. But it certainly won't determine the character of the regime change. And that's a very big difference between the two interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. You're not going to have a Karzai or a Maliki in Tripoli after this, because it's going to be the Libyans who are going to be deciding this. Bombs from the air and NATO air power augmented with Qatari and UAE jets as well is not going to determine what happens. The beauty of this, if I can put it that way, or the best part of it, is that it doesn't prevent Libyans from determining their own future.
Sure.
It merely prevents Gaddafi from massacring people and reasserting his control.
Let me revisit this issue that we touched on a moment ago with you, though, Mohammed, because I started by saying that you're originally from Iran, so you will certainly have a feel for this answer, perhaps better than the rest of us, and that is, do people who live in the region, are they aware of the contradiction that some in the West see when, on the one hand, we're told, get in here and help us, please, but on the other hand, don't stay too long or don't come in at all? Are people aware of the contradictions?
Well, there is a contradiction. People live the contradictions, and I think when one makes major decisions like this, has to look at past cases and how they have developed, particularly in the Middle East. My argument would be that despite the intentions, really good wills and good intentions and humanitarian concerns, unfortunately, I hope it goes the way everyone talks about it. It may not go the way we want it to go. And partly, it has to do with that a civil resistance is being increasingly transformed into a military showdown. And here, this is not going to enable Libyans, and is going to also create a lot of unintended consequences with people that have been armed by Gaddafi and his associates, and that will have a very unintended consequence.
Obi, you wanted to follow up.
No, let me just say...
But that was happening in...
Sorry, 1 second, Hussein. Obi wants to follow up.
Let me just say that I understand the broad sort of sensibility that Mohammed is sort of trying to express, but I think that I would beg to disagree sort of in this case on these particular facts. If you look at the sequencing of the events, okay, Gaddafi basically had been massacring ordinary, mostly unarmed Libyans for at least a week and a half or two. He was almost at Benghazi. He had said publicly, in fact, his son had said publicly that they would show no mercy. They were going to massacre people in a large town. I think that it was a much more compelling situation to do something short of boots on the ground. And I think that's a critical difference. There's no occupation here. Now, of course, nobody can predict with any certainty 2 years' time. I agree with your point. But there is no, at least there's no occupation. That's why I think that in terms of calibrating this particular response, that a lot of thought went, and I'm actually quite impressed. I'm on record, I have criticized many American interventions, but what won me over this time was the careful thought, as you said, the careful, and actually come from history. The fact that there are no boots on the ground shows that somebody, advising Obama has an eye to history.
Hussein, a follow-up?
Two quick points. One is the Civil War was already there. This intervention didn't turn a public protest into a civil war. The regime in the transitional authority in Benghazi had troops that had defected to it. They had some heavy weapons. They were beginning to arm themselves. The war was in place. So this hasn't transformed a popular uprising into a civil war. It's intervened in a civil war to prevent the victory of Gaddafi. Mohammed is quite right about unintended consequences. There's no way to predict what those would be. But one thing is for sure, this is not the West acting in a selfish way, except insofar as they cannot, and the other Arabs also cannot accept a Gaddafi victory. If it was just about oil and money and that sort of thing, best thing to do is leave Gaddafi in power. We know we can deal with him. We've been dealing with him for a long time. He sells oil for cheap. He hasn't caused any problems. And really, if this were strictly a kind of neo-colonial adventure, they would have intervened on behalf of Gaddafi, not on behalf of the rebels.
Let me read something here from.
Very clear.
Let me read something, Randall. I'll get you to comment on this first. This is Haroon Siddiqui's column in the Toronto Star from this past weekend. You're laughing already. You read it. You read it. You know what's coming. Here we go.
I'm making a prediction.
For decades, Arabs have been denied democracy, mostly by client regimes of the United States and Europe that financed and trained the dictators' security setups. The mandate of these dreaded outfits has been to keep, quote unquote, the street quiet, lest it resonate with what we did not want to hear. The West helped deny democracy to the Arabs in order to protect oil and ensure security for Israel. The U.S. and its allies must use their clout to back pro-democracy forces. The West clearly cannot militarily intervene everywhere. However, waging war in the name of humanitarian intervention in Libya, but turning a blind eye to Bahrain and Yemen, is too self-serving to ignore. Randall, and he's got a partial list here. I mean, you could add Syria, Saudi Arabia, some other countries to this list. Cote d'Ivoire, there's lots of countries you could add to the list. What do you make of this allegation that we do have to question the West's sincerity because they're awfully selective in where they want to express their interests and values?
Yeah, I mean, what I agree with Siddiqui's comment is that the West has been complicit, and I think most commentators recognize that in providing support to some of these regimes. There's no question about that. What I won't accept is that because we can't intervene in, say, Bahrain or Syria, that makes the intervention in the case of Libya an illegitimate one. That simply doesn't work. And that's the kind of distinction, a third distinction that was implicit in what Hussein said. It's where our values and interests converge, but also simply where we can. Providing air support over Bahrain or over Cairo in the earlier moments of that uprising was simply not an option.
Mohammed, we do hear that argument a lot, which is the fact that we can't fix everything in the world doesn't mean we shouldn't try to fix something or what we can. Do you accept that?
I think the West has responsibility to fix things, but not everything. And I don't view democracy to be a gift of foreigners, gift of the West to the people in the Middle East. I think the 20th century has shown that Middle Easterners have had the capacity to fight for democracy, and they really cherish it. And the authoritarian states, for a variety of reasons, have been able to control and suppress it. Now we have had a historical opportunity because of the convergence of forces that you have a series of democratic movements developing. I think here actually think before you act would have been a better thing to do. I agree that in Libya there was a tendency to move toward, there was a movement toward the civil war, but initially the great success that opposition had, it was impressive. It was actually at the time that the West wasn't looking and declaring support. And as soon as Washington, London, and other capitals in Europe began to utter their support, it was when Gaddafi was reinvigorated, and a guy who was at his last leg of legitimacy all of a sudden gained power. And his look, he even looks different now. You know, partly because he feels much more invigorated by this process. And I think paying attention to that is very important. Paying attention to how the rhetoric, how the support works. Again, Iran has been a very good example. The democratic movement in Iran, particularly after the election, was impressive in the summer of 2009. But as soon as Washington began to support the Green movement, and European capitals began to join force in support of Iranian Green movement. That gave the state the will to suppress it, because now it was very much easier was able to present the democratic movement as agents of the imperial powers.
Obi, you wanted to come back on that.
Yeah.
May I say?
May
I say?
Obi first, and then Hussein.
Okay.
Sure.
I just want to very quickly offer to make two conceptual points, and then I'll just sort of respond quickly. The first conceptual point is that in terms of the interest and value distinction, okay, I think for very long in sort of international relations, literature is becoming increasingly recognized that interest and values are not sort of, there's no firewall between them. Interests are not exogenous givens. Okay, what is in your interest is a product of discussion and debate and cognitive behavior. So and then secondly, just to leave that, I don't want to get too much into the theory, but the second point is that part of our discussion has, through no fault of anyone, has proceeded as if intervention is only military intervention. There's a range of options between not doing anything at all and going in and bombing out places that is available. And where are we? A toolkit.
Where are we on the continuum?
I think in Libya we calibrated somewhere maybe near the 60%, 70% mark, in the sense that we tried a lot of things. But what I'm saying is that in terms of making that, saying that we sort of the West is using a military option in an exceptional extreme case in Libya, and not doing the same in places like Bahrain, where there was use of force, but not carnage at that level, does not mean that there was not intervention. It may not be successful.
Just may not have been on CNN.
Exactly. And also doesn't mean that the West should be excused in not doing anything at all about Côte d'Ivoire. Because there's a lot of things they can do that, short of military invasion, that will put enough pressure there. And it's already putting a lot of pressure, cutting off money from the central bank. There's a whole, so that there's a kind of smart sort of sanctions, smart intervention kind of discussion that needs to be had.
Understood. Hussein Ibish.
Yeah, I just want to say I think Mohammed is exactly correct about Iran, but I think and his description of the relationship between U.S. support and the Green Movement is exactly correct, but I think he's got it wrong on Libya. The main effect of the imposition of the no-fly zone, which is not merely Western, but has robust Arab component in it. I mean, a serious Qatari and UAE aircraft presence. I mean, 6 F-16s is not nothing from Qatar, and the UAE also has a serious presence there as well. This was, first of all, really welcomed by the rebels. I mean, it was celebrated wildly, not only in Benghazi, but in many other places. That's number one. Now, whereas the Green Movement in Iran was very wary about U.S. support and kind of said, you know, back off, hands off, we don't want that. The second thing is that it actually has succeeded in, again, turning the tide in Libya. In the initial phase, Gaddafi was on the defensive. Then it flipped, and his forces started advancing across the desert and retaking these cities, Misrata, and was advancing towards Benghazi. And now the no-fly zone has reversed things, and momentum is again with the rebellion. So actually, I think the cases of Iran and Libya are extremely different, and the effects of the interventions on popular perception and the fortunes of the anti-government movements are completely different, even I would say the opposite.
Okay, about 7 minutes to go here, and Randall, I do want to come to you, but we're going to sort of finish up on this notion of power and responsibility here. There was a fascinating interview that took place by an Al Jazeera journalist and the Italian foreign minister, Franco Frattini, earlier this month. And the question that I think piqued our interest the most was this one. What will you do, you, Italian foreign minister, what will you do to make sure that the future of democracy in Libya is assured? And I wonder what you think that says about the perception of who is responsible for the future of the political culture of the Middle East.
Well, no, it's very clear who the notion is out there that this is a Western responsibility. They entirely agree with Mohammed. It's not. The West doesn't have ownership over democracy. And I would agree with Mohammed and actually say against Haroon Siddiqui, the West is neither responsible for the complete democratic flourishing of these regimes, of these countries, or for their failure. I mean, there's a limited role that the West can play. And what's emerging here in this panel is a consensus that it should support democracy. There might be disagreement on whether it's proper for the West to pronounce or not. And I have a point to make on intervention, but I've probably talked enough,
Okay.
so I'll
Well, no, go ahead.
carry on.
Make your point.
What I want to say is that, against him, coming back to Haroon Siddiqui's point, there are times in which it is simply irresponsible for the United States or a European country to declare support for democracy when they lack the military or the political means to back it up.
For example?
If we think of the Kurds in post-1991 Iraq, where the United States encouraged a rebellion when it was unable, didn't have the authority to go in, and they were massacred.
So that would be an extremely I mean, it's a good example of how ill-advised.
Absolutely.
The Shiites in the south.
Yeah. Let me,
That was actually the Shiites in the south.
Sorry, Hussein knows the details more than I am.
no, Shiites in the south. That's a good point.
No, but you're absolutely right about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in a way, I argued, and I think this no-fly zone in Iraq is almost a tacit apology for 1991.
Mohammed, let me try that same thing to you, because admittedly there is some complicated history along, whatever, 70 years ago, 80 years ago, between Italy and Libya. But is it fair because of that for people in the Middle East to presume that the Italians somehow have a responsibility to make sure that democracy flourishes in Libya today?
I don't think that the Middle Easterners are expecting the West, and they don't assign that responsibility to the West. Actually, I think it's the Western journalists that assign that responsibility to the Western states and use it in the national rhetoric. Actually, if you ask Libyans, I would say that I would argue that the opposition to Gaddafi is highly diverse. While there were those who wanted to have no-flight zone, those who invited military intervention, there were others that were hesitant. Also, we must take into account that in the very early stage of the resistance in Libya, a lot of people defected from the camp of Gaddafi. But he managed to regain support because of the military engagement of the West. And I think we have to be, if we really want to promote democracy, I think we have to be smarter in our interventions and in utterances in support of this and that democratic movement. And often it may be useful to abstain from making a judgment and let the people who know the local situation act.
Well, in which case, let me follow up with Hussein on that. Do you think we are at a point yet, Hussein, where the vast preponderance of people in the Middle East and in Northern Africa, where we've been watching all of the events transpire over the past couple of months, believe in their guts that they have ownership for their own democratic futures right now, and that it's nobody's responsibility in the West to make sure that they have it?
Yes, I do think that, and I think, in fact, that backing off is usually the best thing that can be done. Sometimes there's a need for intervention. I think there was one in Libya, but usually, in most cases, backing off, backing away. And the key thing is not getting in the way of the reform process, pressuring governments to make the necessary concessions, and giving rhetorical support and encouragement, and maybe even through NGOs, training and help to pro-democracy groups is a very good idea. But what I think people in the Arab world really want from the West is to get out of the way. The common perception, the received wisdom, is that the United States stands between the Arabs and democracy because the autocratic pro-Western regimes invoking the myth of this supposedly hostile, dangerous Arab street, it has essentially serves as an outsourced means of control for the West. And so if people understand that the West is going to not be in the way, I think that's absolutely crucial. I think the second thing that's really important is an effort, and I think the idea of elections now is almost universally accepted in the Arab world, including by most Islamists. Only royal families and ruling families or the most extreme Islamists like Al-Qaeda are against elections. Everybody else understands that elections are necessary for legitimacy. I think the other side of the coin, so in other words, they kind of get Jefferson, if I can put it that way. What's missing is Madison, the restraint on a democratic majority, the limitations on government, the potential for tyrannous majorities, and the need to have strong constitutional protections for women and minorities and individuals. And that's something that I think Western NGOs, especially those that have Arab Americans and Arab Europeans and others involved in them and are deeply involved with working with the practitioners on the ground who are doing the reform work throughout the Arab world, we can really help in shifting the conversation away from this elections business that is a consensus onto drawing people's attention to the need to restrain potential tyrannous majorities, which I see in the long run as the biggest single pitfall left.
Obi, we've got a minute left. I'll give it to you. On that issue of whether or not the people in the Middle East, in vast numbers, now understand that it's their baby and it's not the West's job to get democracy to them.
I think they understand it. They've always understood it. I agree entirely with Hussein in Washington that part of the responsibility, pro-democratic responsibility of the West is not to get in the way. And much more than that, not to actually hinder democratic groundswells by supporting tyrannical regimes there.
Thanks, everybody, for a most interesting discussion about a very important topic these days. In our Washington studios, I want to thank Hussein Ibish, the American Task Force on Palestine, and you can see more of his work at ibishblog.com. And here in our studios, Randall Hansen from the University of Toronto, Mohammed Tavakoli from the University of Toronto, Obiora Okafor, Osgoode Hall Law School. Good of all of you to join us tonight on TVO. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.